the language of my community. I need to cite so and so, said this in this year, and this is the framework, and all the models and standard deviation. But in the end, like we need to like zoom in. What is the actual finding? What is the change that I want to affect? And what's the evidence that I have that that change took place and can be replicated or scaled up or needs more funding so that I get to that evidence because I have a promising program, right? So sometimes when we try to step out a little bit of our academic world, speaking to our peers, we need to, as I put it here, is not about dumbing down what we do, but it requires a skill to translate complexity in a way that is still compelling, that is, let's say, elegant, so that you communicate that message to achieve your result. And you can use models or diagrams, but you need to be very sharp in your messaging. What else? Active and ongoing partnerships with communities, either affected by a problem or benefiting from the research that you are doing. And also partnerships with decision makers. It could be school districts, it could be national government, it could be private sector, because they can help you scale up the work that you do and reach many more children and young people. And show a clear path so that research results can be applied meaningfully to broader populations. Because I'm sure all of you here, you do not want to only, like in my case back then, it wasn't my goal, like I am going to only benefit these 100 children with my research and that's it, and for life, I'm going to work here. You want your ideas to be taken up, for these models to be translated, contextualized in different places, and reach, like make your mark, your maximum impact. So the first example that I want to show you, or walk through, is contextualization of science education curricula using a culturally relevant approach. That's part of the research that I did a while ago, when I was still in academia. So the research question back then was, what does it mean to contextualize science curricula in a culturally relevant manner for indigenous middle school students? That was in Mexico, in a tiny village, so that learning of challenging science ideas is facilitated. And in this case, the challenging idea was natural selection. That those of you who are in this field know it's been demonstrated to be very hard to like teach well and for students to engage with this content. So how do you do it in this type of context? So if you go through, and this is in a 2016 George paper, all the methods are there in detail. So this is like a hyper summary of the methods, right? But I used a ton of stuff because, of course, I wanted to be rigorous, and everyone who advised me, including Joe, wanted it to be rigorous and to get it right. So that's amazing. That's how we do good research. So I use ethnographic observations in classrooms of communities, cognitive interviews to explore teleological bias. So I work also with people in the psychology department. So my structured interviews with elders of the community, I went and lived, relocated to an indigenous community in the midst of nowhere, and did everything I could to understand and engage people. Analysis of the students' artifacts, quantitative analysis of learning aids. So it was a mixed methods study. I could go on, and you can read all this. But does this detail of information about my methods matter to everyone for decision making? I don't think so. If I am defending my dissertation, yeah, of course it matters. I need to be able to explain this. If I am teaching a methods class, I need to be able to articulate this clearly for my students because we want good researchers, right? If I am talking to policymakers, or if I go and meet school principals, or the Secretary of Education in this country. I think when they see this, I'm going to lose them. It's not relevant. Now, this I thought it was amazing. I still think it's amazing. So those were the empirically derived principles for contextualizing curriculum and science units. And it uses very interesting theoretical frameworks about culturally relevant science education, border crossing, traditional indigenous knowledge. It worked in practice. Like, if you are a researcher, you can understand what I'm talking about here, right? But if you just read quickly through that, like, who do you think is my audience? Who can engage with this type of language and acronyms and jargon? And it's a very specific subset of people. It's science education researchers. It's not even education researchers at large. It's very specific. So if I hand this to anyone in Create, they'll run with it. Yeah, we're part of this community. They will know what this means and what to do with that. If I go with this and I give it to, I don't know, the school district in Lansing, it will need some tweaking so that it makes sense. So we need to know our audience. So how did I translate everything that I have shown you now so that it made real world impact? So what are the actual key findings in a nutshell? First, including culturally relevant information practices in science curricula for 7th graders did not negatively affect their learning. That's important because that's one strong belief that is held everywhere, that you are confusing the students by doing this border crossing and including culturally relevant practices and talk about what they believe and what they think. Well, it turns out evidence says not a problem, folks. Actually, the students are learning. The difference between pre and post test was significant. Effect size, 0.4, what that means is a moderate effect. So it's good for education standards for an 8-week unit. We're good. And what we do have some principles that are solid and could be used to contextualize this and use this model across context. So if you want to do this, could be done. Researchers can help. And then all the other information that I shown you gets to the right people, right? What happened with this? And that's part of finding the right context, because the policy environment was right there. One of my first engagements in UNICEF was working supporting the government, the Ministry of Education in Peru, to implement their intercultural bilingual education policies. And this was translated in a way that wasn't even necessarily STEM. It was larger than that. So what happened? Like, this type of thinking to influence my colleagues, decision makers, people in government, led to mobilizing 25 million from international cooperation and private sector, 9,000 teachers receiving classroom support and materials for implementation in mother tongues, in indigenous communities, in the Amazon forest, like where children do not enjoy good quality education. Close to 1,800 teachers. Actually, after this, they were excited and they pursued teacher certification on this that was paid with all this money. And in terms of policy, like, the government saw this is kind of working. So what's the next step? If you're teaching in culturally relevant manners, if you're saying that mother tongue matters, that needs to translate into assessment. And that sounds minor, but it's a huge thing that a government, a Ministry of Education, invested in creating the high stakes assessment like ELA here. to assess the students in their own mother tongue. So then the comparison between this population and the rest of the country was fair, and it makes sense to students. So that's one example of how this is a successful example. It doesn't always work, of how you can use these ideas, these models to make real world impact. And then once it works in a country, it's easier to implement these models and to raise funds to apply this in other contexts. I need to point here. Okay, it's not working. Oh, so there's some message here.
What happened?
There was a pop-up message. Okay. Something is not working here. Let me see. Okay, made it work. This is example number 2. 8 years ago, when I joined UNICEF, then it was like, oh, these are really cool ideas and cool research, but children around the world cannot read and write. So your STEM thing and science thing, that's kind of a luxury for high-income countries. So great, but like thanks, but no thanks. So then, like the example in Peru, it was more towards these ideas are great and these work, but let's see if it works more for literacy and numeracy, and it did. So that's good. So what was one of my, and this was like a long time effort, engaging a lot of people, and is setting the internal strategy and narrative of a STEM education for UNICEF, meaning that's what we're telling governments across the world to do. They don't have to do it. But as the UN, we have an authoritative voice. This is good for children and their quality of education. And it is extremely important for girls to have the same opportunities to learn science and technology, develop these skills, and access the jobs. So what we did, and I am going to go quickly through this, and I can share these slides. We use a ton of data that is well respected and is publicly available. So this is OECD data from like PISA and other assessments. It's not that it can be necessarily challenged. It's not perfect, but there's a strong methodology. We know what it means. It shows that even though there are improvements, girls continue not doing as great in many countries in science compared to boys. And this is not working.
That's not working.
Yeah, it's like it shows like the outlook keeps on popping up.
Yeah, that's good. So,
Yeah, I guess it will work.
without
So then we have and there's a report that you can all check out, and I think if you don't have the links already, I can share with you all. Like there are differences by socioeconomic status. There are differences by, like, for example, girls are underrepresented amongst the highest performers. For the average is like, we're fine. And all these decisions are political, right? The government can choose to say, well, it's fine. We have reached parity. Like girls are learning in the average, they are all fine. This is not my main problem. But you could also say, if amongst the top performers, there's mostly boys, then there is an issue, because there should be equality at the levels, and girls and boys are equally smart. So this cannot be. There's some underlying causes there. And all this, but the thing is that this is publicly available information. It's not rocket science, right? Where maybe I'm shedding some light on the problem, breaking down the numbers a little different, graphing stuff to show certain differences more prominently. Here you can see this problem solving, like we can do lots of things with data if we want to play with data. More like we can compare low income countries versus middle income countries, high income countries. Yes, this is unequal across contexts. Like if you want to argue for more investment in low income countries, the data is there, right? So what people need to hear is that what do we do? What's the model? How do we change this? So we develop something like this, a model of gender responsive STEM education that includes agency and voice, critical understanding. How do I use these skills, these STEM knowledge and skills to be empowered, to make decisions, to be agentic? It needs to take into account learning outcomes as well. It needs to take into account transition to employment and empowerment. So this approach, if it's easier to break down, easier to communicate, if we do it right, then it starts challenging traditional views of men and women and what girls are able to do or not do, and how they should be given a space equally as boys to run with this knowledge and skills. So then one, as I said before, something that maybe really obvious for people in the STEM space, STEM education field, is why is STEM necessary, right? But that was something that we needed to make the case for that, and that's important. We cannot just take it for granted because that's our research and we believe it needs to be that way. So part of the narrative is this, like, for example, we cannot afford to live in a world where scientific and technological solutions that are desperately needed for climate change, for example, and we'll get to that, exclude girls in rural locations, because that's half of the world's talent, right? It sounds very obvious, but that's what happens. So these are main reasons, salient reasons, why STEM learning is good for every child and girls should not be left behind. And then the other piece, once, okay, you've made your case, all the data that was there, all the compelling messaging justification, why STEM for girls? This is the model. You need to take into account agency, empowerment, transitions to the workplace. And it's, okay, so what are the solutions? You cannot just point out the problem without pointing at the solutions. That's very important. So that report includes a number of solutions across the world. Like during COVID, girls in Afghanistan, and that was all over the news, through programs that we supported, design a ventilator that could be used in hospitals for COVID, and it was used. It was low cost, it worked, it responded to an immediate need. Then there are a number of policies, programs from early childhood to university education, where it is described how these governments have done it and what the program is about. So then what are the results of all this? So then we have our report, we have set global strategy, global narratives, and feature solutions. And then what happens after that? Because again, it's the real world impact. Something needs to happen in real life. So as of now, pilot programs in 4 countries of this approach have been transitioned into national scale implementation in Bangladesh, Bolivia, Egypt, and I forgot the 4th one. And this actually translated into a broader program that is called Skills for Girls, where this is being scaled up, in 22 countries, with governments taking ownership, investing in domestic budgets, mobilizing international aid to do this. So then but I don't have any control over this. This is not my program, right? But it's happening. Like children, girls in now 26 countries are getting the benefits of this. And I guess my last, you cannot see the top part, but it says example 3, climate change and education, and that's my current agenda. As you see, and you may have seen this weekend, like most young people care about what's going on with our planet, with the acceleration of climate change and its effects. Everyone, well, not everyone, but a lot of people want to take action, want governments to take decisive action. So what's the data? And this is a bit jumbled up. But what we have seen in terms of data here, 500%, that's huge, increase in the number of climate-related disasters over the last 50 years. And we can see it everywhere, and you can see it in the United States as well. 58% of all deaths from those disasters occurred in fragile contexts, in countries where the infrastructure is not strong, where recovery efforts are slow to come. If we wait 20 years, it's going to be too late. Like it's already kind of too late, but this is going to be devastating. And the estimated total damage caused by disasters only in those 6 years, between 2012 and 2018, is 300 billion globally, and now it's way more. So how do we get to these net zero carbon emissions? So the reality globally, and this is more stuff, the reality globally is there is a climate-related disasters. Schools are affected because they are either destroyed or children cannot get to school. And the most marginalized children see their learning disrupted. So they don't have the opportunity to learn as they should be doing. So there's learning disruptions, increase in school dropout, intensification of intergenerational poverty. The current climate finance architecture and the priorities in the climate agendas do not include education. Every country in the world has to come up with something called non-determined contributions and national adaptation plans, and that's part of the Paris talks that you have maybe heard about, and that it was kind of a big deal in the US because of different governments, the US has gone back and forth, as you all know. So then, how do we get education in the conversation? And how do we present effectively to policymakers education as a core strategy for climate adaptation and climate resilience? So we need again to kind of simplify all this data and try to make the case. So yes, there is increased extreme weather events, droughts, floods, heat, the changing of seasons and their predictability are being affected as well. There is this triple planetary crisis, climate change, nature and biodiversity loss, pollution and waste. So what is that leading to? There are direct and indirect effects on educational outcomes. And that brings actually a need for increased education budgets to respond to that, to maintain the quality of education. And what we're seeing is the opposite. We're seeing almost everywhere a decrease in education budgets. So we need to offer a solution. What is it that we are doing and that we're asking every government in the world to do? So work on 4 things, the best you can, because this is very complex, but we need to kind of break it down in actionable items. So 1, greening learning and skills, super important. And STEM plays a huge role here. So people like young children, teens, high school students, university students, everyone need to develop green skills, not necessarily to go into green careers, but because we need to understand what's going on and adopt sustainable lifestyles, and we need to know how to protect ourselves in the context of all these changes, especially if your community is in a climate hotspot.
What's a green learning skill?
Huh?
What's a green learning skill?
So
What's an example?
An example of a green skill could be, we could go from things as practical as learning how to install a solar panel and how solar energy works to provide energy. But we could go to something more sophisticated, such as understanding climate data and how, if we put it very technically, if we want to inform or we want to understand why is it relevant in the conversations in like COP28 or this year, but the conference of parties that is the big climate talks every year, that there's always this discussion, are we going to agree to a 1 degree more increase or 2 degrees? And for people, most people in the world who don't understand the science, they don't have that skill, they don't know what's the big deal. Why are all these people fighting over 1 degree? It sounds like nonsense, but it has, so understanding how this data, climate data, and the repercussions. So if we have a 1 extra degree increase, that can alter climatic patterns all over the world, intensify the frequency and intensity of hurricanes, affect agricultural cycles leading to, so all that, a more sophisticated version of a green skill. But there's tons. Youth-led climate action. So we have a full generation of people who care about this. They are ready to act, but they need the space to act, to be heard by government decision makers, and the space and safety to keep their governments accountable. Bringing capacities of systems. So teachers need to know how to teach this. There should be learning materials. This type of programs, policies should be included and budgeted for in education sector plans. And greener and safer learning facilities, that's an easy one, so that schools can withstand the impacts of climate change. So this is a quick quiz, just for fun, and I am about to wrap up. So education plays a crucial role for accelerating climate results and for building better coping mechanisms and adaptation mechanisms. What % of global climate finance do you think is invested in education amongst those options? So who thinks it's 30%? Raise your hand. That would be amazing, but yeah, no. Who thinks it's 3%? No one. Who thinks it's 0.3%? Okay, some hands. Who thinks it's 0.03%? Okay, the other half. It is C.
Oh, it's C?
Yeah, it's pretty bad. Pretty bad, but not as bad. So, and this is the best figure that we have as a field. It's based on a okay analysis done by FCDO, that is the UK Development Agency, because they released a policy paper with a lot of like key data and information. When you dig deeper, and that's where research skills are very useful about where this figure came from. It's not that clear, and the methodology is not amazing, but it's the best we have, which has a lot of room for work for all of us. So the investment is teeny tiny. So then what are we doing? With whatever resources are there and through advocacy, working with governments, working with young people. So we are supporting and making it safe for young people to engage in issues of climate, energy, environment, or disaster risk reduction in 104 countries across the globe. We're supporting the integration of climate, energy, environment, or disaster risk reduction in education and greater skills through curricula, through learning materials, whether it's formal or non-formal, in 63 countries. And we are trying to provide actual solutions that are understandable for policymakers, for private sector, so that we have in India, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Armenia, we are integrating climate change, green skills into curriculum of K to 12 education. More than 10 million children engaged so far this year. In Kenya, we're working on green skills for young women in rural places to build agribusiness and promote their empowerment and circular local economies. In Burundi, girls are using STEM to get into renewable energies, solar, building clean stoves. So for many women around the world who are tasked with cooking for the family, for the community, they have to be inside whatever structure or home and breathe all day long, just smoke from those kitchens. So you see around the world, a lot of women with emphysema, as if they would have been smokers their whole life. And that's a public health issue that now girls with their STEM skills, with their awareness of climate change and how they are contributing, are creating these solutions. In Ecuador and Paraguay, we're putting youth movements in contact with policymakers for real policy dialogue and policy change. And in Mongolia, volunteers are measuring air quality constantly and alerting community and schools. Because in some places of the world, you cannot just go online like here, when the Canada smokes came, like you just go to Google and see what's the AQI in your area. And you're like, oh, okay, it's bad. I'll just stay inside. That's not possible everywhere in the world. And there are more solutions, but in these first months of trying to get this message across to decision makers, to bilaterals, governments, private sector, we have mobilized 10 million for continue working and growing this work. And that's a drop in the bucket because the need is huge, but there is some progress, and all this is trying again to translate research, what you do, what comes from spaces like this at MSU and at CREATE into like real world impact. And that's it for today. So thank you so much.
Questions for Ingrid?
Okay, so thank you so much, a great presentation, and there are several of us with many related interests in the room here. My question is not a STEM question, it's more the global sort of policies.
And can you introduce yourself, maybe when you ask questions?
That's it, yes. My name is Amita Jurka. I'm a faculty member at the College of Education, and I know several people here, and I some of the others there. My question is this, and please feel free to respond to it or leave it aside as you see fit. So, you know, I find this, the various global actors involved in the ways in which climate gets attention or not, education gets attention or not, quite interesting. And for example, I know right now the USA has a very strong push, and there's a broad BAA, I think is what they call broad agency agreement, but they're pushing for climate and education. And I know, I think they're also citing the FCDO research that you were speaking about. So I'm just curious to hear how UNICEF, USA, how the push that at least I'm seeing from USA in this space, climate and education, sort of influences back and forth of what you do and how you influence the work. So that's my question.
Thank you. And that's a question more about the global aid architecture. So USA came with something called CAPE just recently. That is a partnership for climate education. And that's actually a collaboration with FCDR. So they are pulling money. It's small money. It's very small money. Only for US-based organizations or consortia to apply. And they are using an interesting methodology where those who apply and prove to have good ideas are invited to a brainstorming where you have to sign an NDA. Yeah, it's called a co-creation meeting. But like, let's get real. Like, if you all apply and you won the grant and you are in this room with 4 other universities who also won the grant. And you all sign an NDA and you leave that space and it's all writing to get it right for USA. Are you going to like share all your ideas? People are not doing it. So it's well-intentioned, and that happens a lot in international policy. Like it's well-intentioned, doesn't necessarily work. The impact so far, it's in brainstorm stage. So it's not clear. So it feels like, okay, great, it's something. But if I would be an 18-year-old, I would be upset if I would learn about this because the world is falling apart. And we have a room of people like thinking about what's good research on climate. Like action is needed now. Like people are dying, children are not learning because their schools were ravaged or will be, right, by climate change impacts. So there are other actors that are actually investing more and more engaged and more vocal. Norway is one of them. So anyway, I hope that helps.
Yes, so I have a question about what would be a way of, there's a lot of policymakers right now in countries who are a little bit of, well, in the US in particular as well, people who are opposed to climate education, like that. What are some ways of getting climate education, in your opinion, through to people who are might be resistant to it? What are some creative ways we can work around that? For example, I have a colleague out in Wyoming who's not allowed to use the word sustainability.
Yeah, spin it. Everything is narrative, or narrative is everything. So we have this case in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Kyrgyzstan. Climate change is political because there's a green party that is perceived as like a certain range of the spectrum, to put it politely. So we still do the work and it's big, but we don't ever say climate. We say this program is a STEM for girls because that's a country where they want to show the world that they are working decisively towards gender equality, modernizing the country, and everyone likes tech. And there's huge investments from the US, including UAE, big oil superpower in STEM for girls. Once the money is out there and with teachers, no one cares. That's the sad reality. No one cares what happens in the classroom. You can teach all the climate you want and use the word sustainability all day long. You cannot put it in your grant or in the policy because it will get into the news and then there's backlash, right? So in the past administration, to give an example, in the US, there was a list of words that could not be used in grants or policies. We could not, and we had actually a bit of an issue because we had the Nordic countries pushing for a clear stance on comprehensive sexuality education for girls. And that's part of the STEM and health. And we had the US saying like, this does not belong, this conversation in this space. It should not be any national policy or international policy, so please remove it. And every family will see what they want to do. Like we are neutral agents. I cannot tell any government this is right or wrong, but we cannot stop the work, right? So, and even people in USA knew that like we just need to find ways to continue delivering the work that is needed in communities across the world. We just need to communicate it in ways that are going to promote uptake and sustainability of these ideas. So yeah, everything is how you communicate ideas.
So I thought it was interesting that you brought in Kazakhstan, because just like the example Jonathan mentioned, right? We have a colleague in Wyoming who can't talk about climate change. But that's because oil is a big part of their revenue. The same thing is true in Kazakhstan, right? Shell is really embedded in that country to extract the oil. So it's a major part of their revenue.
Yeah, but then what's the, like, if people don't want to hear the word climate, fine. But it's like, okay, you want the jobs for your children, they need to get the skills. Done. Like we don't, like in many instances, I guess we think that is needed to provide a lot of extra information when it's not needed at every level. I guess we need to provide whatever is needed and enough with transparency. If people ask, then we say whatever needs to be said. But in those contexts, it's like right now, COP, the Conference of Parties of the big climate talks, the presidency this year is with the UAE, the Arab Emirates. It's a big oil superpower. They are leading climate conversations. So you see protests all around the world. Do I say, and I think it's productive to say, well, this is kind of like a double standard, so I'll walk away, save your research dollars? No, because it doesn't no one any good, at least in this space where I work of international development. And it's how do we promote them? So something that is interesting is and I am directly working on that, supporting the Minister of Education of the UAE to create a climate action framework for K-12 education that will translate into training packages for teachers and learning materials for students. And they don't need anyone to support that work in terms of financial input, but they need some guidance. And they are going to tell the world this year, like everyone, ministers of education around the world, you need to teach climate change in the schools. If they're willing to do that, great. Right? So it's interesting. Any other questions?
I'm just curious how you thought you decided to like get involved in understanding national development, what that process looked like,
And
what that process looked like.
So
Yeah.
Well, the process is easy because you just apply for the job. Like I'm not trying to be dismissive, but that's the reality. Like I was talking to some students yesterday, all these jobs are publicly available and you need to apply and compete for that. Like there's a system. Even being inside the organization, if I want a different post within the organization, I need to apply for that and take a test, an interview, and it's a whole process, let's say. So just apply. But again, everything is how you present information. If I present myself as like, I love mixed methods, and this is what I love to do, and I love ethnographic stuff to design curriculum, they're not going to hire me. Because that's not a research institution. That's a United Nations actor in the whole international development and humanitarian architecture. So before starting my PhD in the US, I worked advising governments. So that's some experience and skill sets that I brought with me. And I tried to keep in touch with those networks while I was completing my PhD. So I used my summers for consulting, for keeping engaged in projects. But that meant that I followed not necessarily a traditional path when I was pursuing my PhD. That's not necessarily a great fit for every advisor. I had one who happened to be very, very supportive of that. So it worked for me in that particular context, but I needed to be okay with the fact that I wasn't working in a single grant and my tuition was guaranteed 100%. So you make choices, right? Actually, I did work as an assistant professor, tenure track, but then you need to make hard choices because you need to publish and you need to do, at least in the institution that I was, it was very US focused, right? That was the expectation of me. So my choice was to step away. Great, I feel great, amazing accomplishment. Some people may think I'm crazy, but I'm going to apply to these other jobs and let's see what I get. And I got one, and here I am. So I hope that answers your question.
I have a question. So I'm gonna link back to your first point about jargon. So I was curious, what's like the jargon word that you would really encourage all of us to avoid? Like what are the top jargon words that you see people use?
Scale up,
Yeah,
scale up. That's
That's a
a
jargon.
good one. Because that's kind of jargony. Like people don't use that in their day-to-day life. Like if you talk to your aunt, like you don't say like scale up, that's not a normal word. So I consider that jargon that I use like every day, because then you go and talk to a donor or a government, and what do people want? Like, this is great research, this is a great program, we need to scale it up, and we need money for that. So that's one.
so how would you say it otherwise? If scale up is a jargon, then when you're talking to someone, you would say,
We want to reach the maximum amount of children we can. Yeah, but then if you say something like this, it's like, oh, this woman is kind of wordy. So then it's scale up. But that's a good question, because every field has their jargon, their acronyms. International development is not the exception. So I speak with a lot of jargons and acronyms, just like this, like, and you don't even realize. It's like, oh, in an email that I could write to someone, is like, copies coming up, so work on your NAP. Like, it makes no sense to anyone outside of that field, right? So in bridging between different worlds, you need to be aware of that and how to translate that jargon, that information to different audiences.
so I would imagine, going back to the first slide, that contextualization would be a big
Yes.
jargon term.
Yeah, so when I started working at the UN and I said contextualization, people look at me like, what? But that's what people were doing, and what it needed to be done. And actually over time, in these 8 years, I found that it resonated a lot with the colleagues that manage all the digital learning across the globe, but they called it localization. And by calling it localization, Microsoft, who funds a lot of that, they get it. It's understandable to them. Then we go to governments, and the question is like, oh, there's this content or these units. Do you need to make any changes? Easy. And if they do, then what I tell them, the other people, is okay, so the Ministry of Education in Zimbabwe, they want to localize this content by making these changes. So it's a lot of, like, to put it in my previous context, it's a lot of border crossing and a lot of like using language and frames differently to achieve your goal.
Thank you for.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I'm Christopher, and my question, you talked a lot about the work you've done with research and recommendations, but have you done any work with implementation? And if you have, what is that?
That's a huge question, because we do implementation all over the world. And if you work in an international organization, not a single person can do and run and implement a program. It's a team of people, and in the good examples of work, you're working with teams in government and communities as well. So everything that I have shown today, every single thing is implemented. Otherwise, there would be no real world impact. And that's kind of the point of this conversation today. So everything that I show you today and share with you has been implemented. So it's not only like, okay, now I wrote this full report about STEM for girls. Now it's being implemented in 26 countries and it's part of programs and policy. And when people are posted in country offices, they go through the nitty-gritty of implementation, budgets, programs, interactions with teachers, with technical staff, administrative education. If you are at global level, you have a bit more distance and you advise on that process. But, and I was discussing with Joe this, one of the key features of the United Nations Children's Fund is that we implement government policy hand in hand with government in every nation in this planet, literally. Other agencies like UNESCO, they work at policy level, they don't have country offices everywhere, they produce amazing global public goods, but then governments decide if they want to implement or not. In our case, it's way more targeted. I think we're on time.
Other questions? Howdy, you talked about working with local actors, with state actors, government actors. And you brought up the significance of narrative, and I was kind of curious, how do you work at within UNICEF, how do you work alongside other similar actors, UNESCO, World Bank, etc., to set the narrative that create or that then influences this kind of policy implementation and research?
That is idea, that doesn't always happen. So right now, in terms of climate and education, we have a new and ongoing collaboration with the UNESCO, and that's the agency, the UN agency for like scientific and education and culture advancement. UNEP, the UN agency for environment, UNFCCC, and they are a specialized agency in climate, and UNITAR. They are specialized in training and building capacities around the world. There's 5 agencies. And we are on message to just, this week has been crazy because this Thursday, we have a whole day workshop inviting like G7 nations and a lot of people with influence to, again, co-create, decide together what are the priorities for climate and education, what we want the message to be during COP this year, December in UAE, so that we influence policy and we want to persuade people, governments, to create something that is called a multi-partner trust fund. There's money. Money also talks and leads. If there's no money, we cannot do the work, right? So this work needs to be funded. So that's an example, it's a nice example of concerted coordination efforts within the UN with bilateral agencies. So this is a nice example. I really do hope it works. But there are many instances where that coordination is not in place, and you see competition amongst UN agencies, mixed messages from different bilaterals. As I said in the beginning, you get one message from Sweden, another message from the US, and it's opposite, right? So it's not perfect, and we need smart people like you all to engage and be vocal and get informed to continue advancing education for everyone.
Great, well, let's give Ingrid a big hand.
Thank you, Joe.
And I want to remind everybody that the next Create presentation will be on October 10th. And Tom Belloc from Israel will be here talking about monitoring. So mark that on your calendar, October 10th, Tom Belloc. He'll be talking about modeling. He does a lot of, like Ingrid, he does a lot of global work in different countries with modeling. But not, she doesn't do modeling, but she works in different countries. Anyways, thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe.
What time's your bus?
No.
Oh, you got.
So I have some time.
Yeah.
It was fun.
Yeah, nice crowd, a different crowd, where there's some people that I recognize, but some people I don't recognize. Maybe people probably have some questions.
Again, good to see you again. I forgot to ask you for your card yesterday, so
I don't bring any with me.
All right.
Sorry.
So
But,
which email
my
address should
email-
I use? Give it to you.
Uh,
Came here without a.
You can write me and I'll send you.
Okay, I'll do that then. Great.
It's probably the easiest way.
That makes sense.
This, I'm pretty check, I haven't seen that. I'll send you.